Good afternoon, live from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to our virtual discussion. Illicit financial flows. Is Zimbabwe's health sector affected? Hello, I'm your host, Andy Hodges. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpapers TV network, ZTN, and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Now, should you have any comments or views on our program this afternoon, please feel free to contact us via our Facebook page, Zimpapers TV network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. The health of Zimbabwe's young population is a primary determinant of economic well-being and poverty reduction. Along with other social sectors such as education, investment in the health sector has been a stated national priority since independence, and access to basic health care is now enshrined as a constitutional right for all citizens and permanent residents. Despite nearly universal recognition of the critical importance of an effective and equitable healthcare system, the sector faces both long-standing and new challenges that impact the quality of and access to health services and programs. Many of the challenges have been attributed to alleged misappropriation of public funds in the form of illicit financial flows. Illicit economic activities contribute to the loss of wealth for the government of Zimbabwe and citizens, depleting resources that could otherwise be invested in the public health system for healthcare worker salaries, procurement of medical supplies, and the rehabilitation and development of health infrastructure. Joining us virtually this morning to discuss illicit financial flows is Zimbabwe's health sector affected are Muchaneta Mundopa, Executive Director at Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ, Norman Mukwakwami, he's a consultant, and Dr. Onesmus Nyaude, Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, ZAC, Head of Research and Knowledge Management. And I will hasten to add that in our show next week, we'll also be talking to Zimbabwe's Ministry of Health to get their views on this subject as well. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. Mucha, let me start with you. The fight against illicit financial flows is heightening in Africa and in Zimbabwe in particular. Why is it so? Why now?
Thank you very much, Andy, and good afternoon to the viewers at home. I think for us to understand why the issue of illicit financial flows has become so important in the discourse of Africa and Zimbabwe in particular in relation to its development, it is important for viewers to understand what it is that we refer to as illicit financial flows. So broadly speaking, illicit financial flows can be defined as money that is illegally earned, transferred, or used that crosses borders. But as an institution, we also consider Zimbabwe's political economy context, and we have broadened this term to include domestic financial flows that are clearly illegal or contrary to formal financial or market norms and against public interest. So back to your question as to why there is a growing discourse and interest in the issue of illicit financial flows. Of illicit financial flows, they reduce the domestic resources and tax revenue needed to fund poverty reduction programs and infrastructure. For example, Andy, in Zimbabwe, it is estimated that the country loses between 570 million to 3 billion United States dollars annually through illicit financial flows. And this is money that could be channeled towards the acquisition of public goods and services such as public healthcare systems, which the majority of citizens in Zimbabwe rely on, or alternatively, safety nets in times like this where the majority of citizens are failing to eke out a living due to the lockdown provisions that have been placed to mitigate against COVID-19. So in essence, illicit financial flows really undermine the capacity of the state its key functions, from the delivery of social and public services to the provision of security to the population. Perhaps also just to add, maybe there might be people, viewers at home, who might be asking themselves, what is the difference between illicit financial flows and corruption? Let me take this opportunity to briefly highlight the two, or the relationship between the two. So while as an institution, we talk about corruption being the abuse of power for private gain, illicit financial flows, on the other hand, go beyond the mere abuse of power bestowed upon public officials for private gain to also include illegal or legal commercial transactions facilitated by tax evasion and tax avoidance, including other criminal activities such as trading in contraband goods and firearms. But what is important to note is that corruption is both a form of illicit financial flows and an enabler of the enabler of one of the two of the illicit financial flows. So as an institution, we also believe that corruption is a catalyst for public resource leakages. And as Tia said, we really are worried about the extent of illicit financial flows in our health sector.
Now, Norman, you heard Mucha there. She talked numbers. I mean, quite staggering numbers. Between 570 million to $3 billion US dollars is apparently, maybe, allegedly illicit financial flows leaving Zimbabwe. So you are the consultant who did the study on analysis of illicit financing in Zimbabwe's health sector. Could you kindly give us an overview of the key findings of the report?
Thank you. So for the study, we broadened the scope beyond what Mucha described as the illicit financial flows. So illicit financial flows focus on what crosses the borders. Now, many Zimbabweans know that there are illicit activities where the transactions happen in Zimbabwe and the expenditure of the money stays in Zimbabwe. So such a transaction, for example, if you pay a bribe at a roadblock, and the person you pay the bribe to does not leave the country with that money, that sort of amount would not reflect in these illicit financial flows. It's still corruption, but it's not reflected. So we broadened our scope to include these domestic transactions, and therefore we then use the term illicit finance, which includes illicit financial flows and the domestic transactions. So in terms of the scale, I think Mucha gave a very good overview of the scale of illicit finance in Zimbabwe. In the health sector, you will find that the public expenditure has gone down over the past 3 years. In 2017, the public expenditure on health was estimated about 110 US dollars per person. That's the total health expenditure, including the private, public, and donor spending. The public sector alone in the first 6 months of 2020 spent just $1.64 per citizen on health. And that's mainly because of the erosion of value of the Zimbabwe dollar over the past couple of years, which has made Zimbabwe increasingly dependent on donors. Now, our study used what we call an applied political economy analysis, where we're looking at the risks that give rise to illicit finance. Basically, what we went out to do was to look at the processes within the health sector and see where are the loopholes, where are the opportunities for illicit finance, what is driving illicit finance, what are the institutional weaknesses there, who are the champions of addressing it, and who are the spoilers, the individuals who do not want the reforms or the laws to work. Now, to do this, we did a significant amount of secondary research and also had many primary engagements with people in the health sector that would know quite a lot. We found about 8 types of illicit finance, and these fall in 4 categories. The first category is trade misinvoicing. So this is when a traded good, which is going across the borders, has its value misstated to allow for money to be moved illicitly across the border. So in the case of the health sector, we find overpricing of imports. So someone finds that a tin of paracetamol is going for $10 in Zambia, and when they import it for $15, and they pay to a related party in Zambia who pays the actual $10, and the $5 goes into a separate account in Zambia. That is the form of illicit finance we find in the first category. In the second category, we found abuse. So here you find tax avoidance and tax evasion. And there isn't a lot of tax abuse in the health sector as compared to other sectors in Zimbabwe's economy, like the transport sector and the mining sector. But there is still some tax evasion done by many of the private operators in the sector. The third category, which is one of the main ones, is the abuse of office. And under abuse of office, you have the petty corruption. So, your bribes. TIZ has found that many people, especially over the past year, have been asked to pay bribes to access health services in Zimbabwe. You also have corrupt procurement, which is by far the biggest issue and the biggest form of illicit finance in the health sector. Then the fourth category, there you find 2 main issues. You find smuggling of drugs across Zimbabwe's borders into Zimbabwe and out of Zimbabwe. And this is a very serious form of illicit finance. And then the other form is theft. And this is theft of medical drugs and other medical supplies from the public health system, mainly by public health workers. And these are then sold out these have been sold out to the public. And the main reason why you have smuggling and theft in Zimbabwe is because there is a huge demand for affordable medication. Zimbabwe's medication from the formal sector is pretty expensive when you compare it to neighboring countries. But, and at the same time, you have very low coverage of health insurance in Zimbabwe. Public health workers are covered under Christmas, and lately you find that not all health services are being delivered. And a shrinking proportion of the citizenry is covered by private health insurance. It's becoming harder and harder to meet those premiums. So because of that, you have this serious demand for affordable medication from people who are not covered by health insurance. And the way in which the informal sector and parts of the formal sector help meet this demand for cheap medication is by smuggling drugs in and avoiding the taxes, and also by taking drugs that are stolen from the public health sector and selling them either on the informal sector or even in some pharmacies. I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks, Norman. Dr. Naude, you heard there what both Mucha said about the quantum of illicit financial flows between 570 million and $2 and $3 billion per annum leave Zimbabwe. And also, of course, Norman there gave the 4 different types of illicit finance in the health sector, normally corrupt procurement, petty corruption, smuggling, and theft. Now, corruption has been cited, as you say in the report, of one of the avenues through which public resources are leaking from the health sector. So I have 2 questions for you, Dr. Naude. First of all, what is your comment of Zach on that? And also, how hard is it to monitor such illicit financial flows? Because as you heard from Norman, some of these are happening outside our borders, transfer pricing, etc. Your comment, sir?
Thank you very much. I strongly agree and embrace what Norman has been saying and what Mucha has been saying. Particularly, I will touch on the findings of the study that they conducted. This study brought in very pertinent issues, particularly in terms of the key findings and the causal effects of corruption. At ZAC, we did a similar research in which we focused on the effects of maladministration and financial mismanagement in the health sector. And we see a correlation in terms of the findings here, particularly the issue of purchase of ventilators, in which you could find that there were some accusations from participants who actually were saying that end users were not consulted, but these ventilators probably were procured from countries as far as India. So in that particular instance, we see a correlation in terms of connivance and syndicates around illicit financial flows. And also related to that, issues of abuse of power that is also touched on. Our findings from a study that we conducted pointed to the fact that the minister's discretionary powers, particularly at the time we conducted the study, was of major concern in terms of particularly appointments of people who are in the executive, in terms of those who procure. Some might not actually have that kind of a medical profession, in which they would rather bring in some kind of products which are not user-friendly to the end user.
Okay, we appear to have just lost the sound briefly. We'll come back to Dr. Naude when we can get him. Mucha Neta, your brief comment from a civil society perspective on corruption as one of the avenues through which public resources are leaking from the health sector?
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. I agree with the findings of the study and the assertion made by Dr. Naude before he was briefly cut off. However, I think from a civil society point of view, I'll just like to highlight that although corruption generally affects all sectors, there are certain unique attributes that make the health sector particularly vulnerable to corruption, such as power asymmetries between the stakeholders in the health sector with limited or no accountability mechanisms put in place, and the complexity of the system itself, where we have a large number of parties involved, that's making it challenging to generate and analyze information in a transparent manner. In this instance, therefore, it becomes very important for us as we are going forward with our discussion for anti-corruption stakeholders to work together with health sector players in order to address the corruption risk and vulnerabilities if Zimbabwe is going to attain the sustainable goal number 3, which speaks to good health and well-being. And specifically, if the government of Zimbabwe is going to uphold and respect the constitutional provisions relating to the right to health care as provided for in Section 76 of the Constitution. I think what has been apparent from both Dr. Nyaule and Norman is that there is corruption within the health sector itself, be it petty corruption or procurement corruption. And that is the discussion both players in the health sector and in the anti-corruption sector should be having.
Right, Dr. Ndaude, I believe, is back. Dr. Ndaude, you got cut off while you were in the middle of your thoughts. Maybe you could continue if you like.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. I was saying, coming on to your other part of the question where you said, how hard is it? From an exact perspective, you wouldn't say it is very hard, rather to stamp out corruption or even eradicate it, particularly in the health sector, because of the current national anti-corruption strategy that was launched by His Excellency. This strategy has brought in a lot of opportunities, particularly some key players like TI coming on to make sure that, at least in the context of the memorandum of understandings that we've signed, we have seen a lot of strides and positive efforts in terms of winning this particular war. What is just needed is a positive attitude and a mindset change in terms of accepting the current mechanisms at hand.
Norman, I want to narrow this down. I mean, I've got two questions really for you. One, if you could briefly answer about the negative impact of illicit finance in the health sector in particular. And also, I want to narrow it down to public procurement. You mentioned that was one big sector or big area whereby corruption may be occurring. So from your analysis, how does this occur in the health sector?
Thanks. I'll respond to the question of the negative impact first. So the negative impacts of illicit finance are on citizen welfare, on the health of the citizens. You have poor health outcomes. You see there's limited amount of public funding that becomes available to meet and pay the salaries of public health workers. So you then have strikes, you have absenteeism, you have a serious brain drain. We lose our skilled health personnel to other countries. And you also have, in the case of COVID-19, you then start seeing work-related deaths due to the shortage of things like PPE. And you also have shortages of medical supplies, water, electricity, and then you also see unsafe drugs that are acquired through theft or through smuggling being sold informally. I'll give an example of insulin. It's a drug that needs to be kept at a particular temperature and stored in the right conditions. If such a drug is smuggled in a Malaysia's car, the chances that its efficacy is still the same become limited, and that may become a death sentence to someone who uses that insulin. The other impacts that it undermines the country's ability to meet the sustainable goals by 2030. Already Zimbabwe was struggling to meet this. Zimbabwe needed, I think, $32 billion over the period 2018-2030 to meet the sustainable development goals. It will only become worse with COVID-19. To make this even more granular, when you look at Zimbabwe compared to countries in the region, Zimbabwe has less doctors per 10,000 people than other countries. Now, Zimbabwe has 2 doctors per 10,000 people. Botswana has 5. South Africa has 9, and Zambia, our neighbor to the north, has 12. And these are the effects of illicit finance as doctors become less attracted to the public health system and less attracted to working in Zimbabwe. And in the long run, these lead to other negative health impacts. Now, going to public procurement, I'll first talk about the scale of public procurement. During dollarization, Zimbabwe budgeted on average about $100 million a year for health sector procurement by the state. Now, when we did our study, we knew that currently a lot more money is going to procurement, is coming from the donors than that which is coming from government. But we deliberately chose to focus on the money that comes from government because this is firstly tax income that's coming from Zimbabwe, from citizens in Zimbabwe like myself. And secondly, this is a permanent source of financing for the sectors. Donors can come in today and leave tomorrow. We need to focus on our systems and the funding that we'll have, which is more sustainable in the long run. That funding has certainly fallen, as I highlighted earlier. It's fallen in the past few years. But again, if the economy recovers, we'll see that funding go back up towards that, hopefully towards back to the $100 million a year. The corruption is driven by the weakness of the institutions around the health sector, around public accountability, around transparency, and around the anti-corruption fight. The weaknesses certainly differ in terms of, as some would explain, certain institutions only have limited mandates. In your previous, I think, discussion, the representative from ZAC was talking about they can only get the dockets out, but the prosecution has to be done by other institutions, and those also need to work. So it's those sort of weaknesses that we start seeing having and driving the corrupt public procurement. We also see weaknesses in the public procurement system itself, where, for example, PRAS, which is supposed to oversee public procurement, is not publishing the notices the right way. It's not publishing the contract awards on its website as is required by the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Assets Act. And without that sort of information in the public, it's very hard for citizens, it's very hard for civil society and even other parts of government to hold certain public actors to account. And we also have a very unstable economy. And the challenge with the instability of our economy is when it comes to procurement of drugs and other medical supplies outside Zimbabwe, many of these very credible companies demand cash because Zimbabwe has a very poor credit rating. There's challenges around accessing foreign currency. And what then happens is you have middlemen who then say, you know what, I will give you these drugs and you pay me in installments. I'll make the initial payment for you. But these people come at a huge cost. Firstly, they need to be given a commission for allowing Zimbabwe to access this sort of credit in access to drugs. But secondly, oftentimes, because they are not credible institutions, for them to win the tender, they have to find someone to bribe first. And eventually, that sort of commission grows because now it has to account for the bribe and so forth. And we've seen cases under COVID-19 of similar middlemen playing a huge role in the inflation of prices of goods that are being procured for the public health system. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Norman. You're watching our virtual discussion this afternoon, Illicit Financial Flows in Zimbabwe's Health Sector. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Now, should you have any comments or views on our program this afternoon, please feel free to contact us as usual via our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. Dr. Naude, you heard the comments there from Norman about how public procurement in the health sector is one major area of illicit finance. So in your opinion, your comment on how health sector procurement can play a part in corruption?
Thank you very much, Andy. I totally agree that public procurement is a major area of concern. In the year 2020, ZAC commissioned another research in the area of public procurement, as well as public finance management. It emerged from those studies that what the consultant is really sharing with us today is very valid. Particularly, I will explore on the issue of the game theory of corruption, where he has alluded to issues of having a triangular kind of a connivance where we have got the intermediator, the bribee, and the briber, whereby these will come up with some kind of a cost-benefit analysis, and then they try to make sure that they up the game in terms of the pursuing their evil motives on illicit financial flows. And this has been happening, particularly where we talk about issues of trying to deliberately ignore e-procurement. You know, people have got this, behavior of trying to like or have a good, a habit of liking the issue of human interfacing. So we found that the absence or near absence of e-tracking systems in terms of following up electronically what has been procured and what has been delivered. This has been something of major concern, which has been fueling corruption, particularly in terms of public procurement. And overpricing, like what he said, in some cases you find our research in terms of maladministration came up with similar findings where you find a lot of gloves which are not very surgical, but they've been procured in large quantities. And then you wonder what the motive of this particular
so Dr. Anude, it then takes me to my next question. I mean, as Zach, are there any anti-corruption efforts targeting at reducing illicit financial flows in the health sector that you're actually carrying out as we speak? What are you doing about it as Zach?
We are doing a lot of things, particularly in the context of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. You agree with me that the National Anti-Corruption Strategy has got pillars. We've got a pillar for detection, pillar for investigations, and we've got a pillar for prosecution. And what we've done now is that stakeholders do form part of the subcommittees or the monitoring groups, particularly in terms of monitoring issues in the health sector. Then in terms of the issues of procuring, we have got also the compliance arm of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. This compliance arm is responsible for putting in checks and balances, particularly undertaking some systems review and processes, in terms of trying to make up the procedures for procuring, the procedures for disposal of assets, particularly in the context of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. A lot is happening, and we are also engaging in capacity building workshops across the various subcommittees of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy in order to make sure that we particularly up the game in terms of strengthening our anti-corruption strategy.
Mucha, I have a few questions for you. First of all, if you could briefly comment on corruption in public procurement. Also, what are the implications of illicit financial flows on the health sector in Zimbabwe? And of course, what are your views on the sources of these?
Thank you very much, Andy. I think Norman and Dr. Nyaude have really done a good job in terms of articulating how public procurement corruption occurs in the health sector. Perhaps I just want to add that COVID-19 has really amplified the extent to which corruption within public procurement is rampant in the health sector. So we've seen that the rapid and emergency purchases of healthcare equipment to address the pandemic has exposed vulnerabilities within each stage of the procurement cycle that are already prone to fraud and corruption. But then again, as an institution, we believe that our systems are not that bad, Andy. But then what is lacking is in terms of compliance and implementation of procedures that are already there. In Zimbabwe, I repeat again, we now have a situation where corruption has become a low risk and high reward area. In as much as we have these pieces of legislation and the procurement rules and regulations in place, you will still find that there are some people who are politically exposed or those who hold senior public offices who take advantage of the few loopholes that are there or simply disregard what the law says to engage in corruption. So in as much as we can discuss about the occurrence of public procurement corruption in the health sector, there is also a need for us as a nation to make corruption a low reward and high risk activity, where those who engage in corruption are severely punished Because at the moment, as a nation, we're only focusing on managing corruption instead of preventing it. You prevent corruption by sending out a signal that it is wrong, corruption does not pay.
You're watching our virtual discussion this afternoon. Illicit financial flows. Is Zimbabwe's health sector affected? This forecast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Mucha, let me come back to you. Do you think that ZAC, Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, is being effective in its anti-corruption fight?
It's a tricky question, Andy. The fight against corruption requires input from various stakeholders, ranging from citizens, the media, civil society organizations, the private sector, and state institutions mandated to fight corruption, such as the ZAC. But however, the success of the institution of the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission is dependent upon a lot of variables, such as the political will to see the institution succeed in carrying out its mandate. And from an organizational point of view, we feel that political is not only shown in terms of creating institutions and pieces of legislations, but also respecting the rule of law and the independence that is afforded to institutions such as ZAC to carry out its mandate without any fear, favor, or prejudice, as well as supporting the institution financially and technically.
Thank you. Dr. Daude, let me ask you straight. Do you think that the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission has been effective in its fight against corruption?
Thank you very much. We have been very effective in our efforts to fight corruption. I'll share with you, like I said, that in 2020, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which is a government strategy, was launched. And this has shown that on the ground, we are trying to bring everybody on board and a collective responsibility in terms of the fight against corruption. And it has been in the public domain that quite a number of memorandum of understanding, MOUs, were signed with the various players, civil society organizations, government departments, even with the neighboring countries. And these strategies, in my view, are a clear testimony that we are very effective.
Okay, thank you. Norman, let me ask you this, of course. We've been talking about this report that you've issued or you should be issuing soon. So when will it be available for the public to view it? It's my first question. And from those research findings that you have shared with us today, how do you rate Zimbabwe against other countries in the region?
Thank you, Andy. So it's a very good question, and there are two parts to the answer. So when you look at the domestic forms of illicit finance, those that happen in each of these countries' jurisdiction, you will note that Zimbabwe, when you look at the CPI, has a much higher perception of corruption than many of its neighbors. And again, measuring corruption is very difficult. Comparing corruption is very difficult. So TIZ has decided to use perceptions of it. So what do your own citizens say? And some countries score well only because their citizens don't know how much corruption is taking place. And one of the downsides of actually fighting corruption is that the more you fight it and the more you reveal what's going on, the higher the perception actually goes up. So for a while, you score poorly until citizens are actually convinced that these exposures are not just exposures for the sake of optics and maybe politics, but are also leading to actual prosecutions. So from that level, I would say Zimbabwe definitely on the CPI has compared poorly with its neighbors. When you look at 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it uncovered a lot of what's also happening in our neighboring countries. We saw serious scandals around procurement of COVID-19 supplies in countries like South Africa, in Zambia to the north, even in many Western countries. And I think for some people, it was a shock to see countries that many have associated with very little corruption or limited corruption, seeing these cases that are similar to what we had also found in Zimbabwe. Now, that's the first part of the question, the first part of the answer. The second part is there are also forms of illicit finance that are regional in nature. So when you look at the smuggling of drugs into Zimbabwe and maybe out of Zimbabwe. It involves players in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in South Africa, in Mozambique. And due to this fact, the comparison falls away, because now what you have is an interconnected set of players. Some would want to call them cartels that run these illegal operations, mainly around the smuggling of medical supplies and especially medical drugs. Yeah. And then with respect to the report, we'll certainly have to get back to you with a date. We'll certainly, you'll be the first to know in terms of when we set a date for the publication of the report.
Thank you. And I'm sure it will be available on the Transparency International Zimbabwe website, hopefully when it is published. Let me ask you all, starting with you, Mucha. You know, I like to get to this, recommendations. What are your recommendations to responsible authorities, civil society and citizens as it relates to corruption and illicit financial flows?
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to be very broad in my recommendations, hoping that perhaps Norman will touch on the specific recommendations as they relate to illicit financial flows. But generally, I think there is need for us as a country, including those who hold political power, to respect the rule of law and principles of good governance. Corruption and illicit financial flows are a symptom of bad governance. So there is need to showcase a political will to win the fight against corruption. And the key is the implementation and respecting the mandate of the various anti-corruption institutions. Like I said before, we need to make corruption a high-risk, low-reward activity, punish the perpetrators of corruption. So as long as there's selective application of the law based on political affiliation or connections, including extractive or rent-seeking tendencies in how we choose to deal with corruption in Zimbabwe, then Zimbabwe will not succeed in the fight against corruption. And certainly as it relates to the SDG 3, in terms of health, Zimbabwe will fail to meet its target.
Norman, you heard Mucha, she passed a lot on to you in terms of explaining recommendations or coming up with recommendations. But I mean, before then, of course, there are a broad set of regional and global experiences that can inform practice within Zimbabwe, are they not? So what would you recommend in terms of cutting down illicit financial flows, or at least trying to find a way of managing them?
Thanks, Andy. So many would agree that the fight against corruption is not easy. It's not going to be done in a year. So what we did in our report is we set out to look at what is the current context that we're operating under, what's achievable in the short term, and these are the sort of recommendations that I will provide today. But there are also recommendations in the report that go beyond the short to immediate term, that look at what also needs to be done in the medium term, in the next 3 to 5 years, and all the way to 2030, what really needs to be done. And those I will leave in the report for those who get around to reading it. I'll focus on the short-term recommendations. And we have 4 sets of recommendations to stakeholders. The first set of recommendations is to the government of Zimbabwe. So the Ministry of Health and ZAC need to strengthen the anti-corruption reporting system in the public health system. We spoke to some doctors who said, we know that drugs are being stolen from the stores room, but reporting a case is a tedious task, and it's just easier to just ask the procurement officers to get us more supplies. So things like that, where the system might exist, but the process of making the report could be too tedious for the people who use the operations, should be the sort of feedback that the Ministry of Health and ZAC should use to see how do we streamline the process? How do we make sure it's anonymous enough, it protects those who report what's going on, and we safeguard the medical drugs in the public health system. The second recommendation is for the Ministry of Health to strengthen its public procurement processes, right? So what goes on at NatFarm, how drugs are procured, the cross-border transactions to pay for them, the storage for it, making sure they're actually not stolen from storage in country. And also ensuring that whoever is supplying the right things which are needed at that time, and also in full, because you also find cases where the supplier only bring 10% of what was pay for and not bring the rest. Then for MCAs, so that's your the regulator for the pharmaceuticals industry and the Port Health Inspectorate, they need to more actively curb smuggling at the borders. For example, I've heard the Port Health Inspectorate and MCAs are only available at Arra International Airport for certain hours of the day and certain days of the week, which creates opportunities for those who smuggle drugs through airlines to know, okay, on Sunday night, just get a flight on Sunday night into Arra International Airport. There will be no Port Health authority in place, official in place to inspect whatever you bring into the country. So very granular things like that will make a significant difference. And then for the Health Services Board, they need to take measures to limit conflicts of interest. We didn't really get around to it, but there's also a lot of petty corruption that happens with, for example, senior doctors who are allowed to run private practices and oftentimes use public resources for their private practices. Their codes of conduct, their standard operating procedures need to be strengthened to ensure that this doesn't happen. Then there's recommendations to the Parliament of Zimbabwe, and Parliament has to hold the Procurement Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe to account for ensuring that it publishes public procurement notices and the contract awards on the website as required by law. So this is just as simple as sticking to the law. Just apply the law. It's as easy as that, and it's just publishing these things on the website. It will go a long way in ensuring transparency and even ensuring ZAC has much easier access to the information it needs. Then Parliament also has to ensure government of Zimbabwe meets the Abuja target. Zimbabwe needs to be spending at least 15% of the national budget on health, more so in the COVID-19 pandemic. Then there's recommendations to the private sector. The private sector needs to be encouraged to conduct regular due diligence of its operations. This is, supply chain due diligence is a growing movement across the world in ensuring that whoever you're dealing with and whatever products, inputs or outputs from your business are not affected by things like corruption and illicit finance. And I would encourage private sector companies in Zimbabwe to do that. Then they should also comply with the New Companies Act. Unfortunately, the requirement for beneficial ownership information to be submitted under the New Companies Act was moved from 2021 to 2023, meaning for the next 2 years, some companies can still choose not to tell us who really owns these businesses, and it will remain a challenge for citizens to know who exactly is benefiting from tenders in the health sector. Then lastly, there is the recommendation to civil society. The CSOs like TIZ, they just need to actively track the steps in the public health procurement at national and local government. These things just don't happen with Ministry of Health. They also happen with the local clinics and the district hospitals in our rural communities. Civil society has to continue holding government to account. It has to partner like-minded CSOs in regional countries to really uncover what's happening with smuggling, what's driving it, and how it can be stopped at that regional level. Lastly, I think civil society really needs to work with our media. Our media oftentimes focuses on the scandal of illicit finance and less on the systematic issues, meaning they really want to focus on the billions and the millions, just tell us how much was lost, forgetting sometimes to go through the process of explaining the steps by which corruption takes place, and therefore empowering citizens, empowering government and other stakeholders to be able to close the loopholes, hold actors to account, and ensure that there's greater transparency.
All right, thank you.
In the health sector.
Thanks, Norman. All right, Dr. Naoude, you've heard my other guest recommendations. What tools do you believe you need above what you have now, or what does that need to do to be even more effective in its fight against corruption? If you could briefly respond.
Okay, I'll talk about the issue of multi-stakeholder response. That here is a problem that we are facing as illicit financial flows. In order to up our game, we just believe that we need a situation where stakeholders should rally behind the context of the national anti-corruption strategy, so that we have a collective responsibility and seriously consider the fight against corruption as everyone's role and responsibility in the country. And above all, corruption is actually committed by individuals. And I would talk about issues of attitudes, what I would term the ethics upfront philosophy. We need an ethical, citizenry who really take the nation before they take on their individual and selfish needs in order to make sure that monopolistic attitudes are minimized at all costs.
Thank you. And of course, I hope the Whistleblower Act, when it's enacted, will obviously help in terms of citizens being able to report corruption without fear. We have come to the end of our show this afternoon. You have been watching our discussion, Illicit Financial Flows. Is Zimbabwe's health sector affected? I'd like to thank our guest, Muchaneta Mundopa. She's Executive Director at Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Norman Mukwakwami, he's a consultant. And Dr. Onismas Nyaude, Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, ZAC, Head of Research and Knowledge Management. Thank you very much for appearing on the program this afternoon. This broadcast was brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, Transparency International Zimbabwe. Well, that's it for me for this show. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and you all be safe.